today we are going to set up a BAP client on our locals using the Honest Sandbox step by step from scratch. So before diving in, this is just a brief overview on Beacon and Honest in general. So currently, right now, if a individual wants to search for content on the internet, such as anything such as courses, skills, jobs, internships, etc., the individual needs to go to that particular platform to actually search for that particular type of content, so, which has resulted into a siloed approach where all these platforms are not able to communicate with each other. So there's no interoperability between these platforms currently. Beacon as a whole is trying to provide a unified experience by introducing an open network approach where it will act as a bridge between the provider platforms and the consumer platform. So for example, if a individual search for courses, it the Beacon network broadcasts that intent across all these consumer platforms to get the relevant data to show it on the provider platform. So if I'm searching for courses, jobs, internships, the Beacon network has the responsibility of searching across all the consumer platforms, different consumer platform. Maybe for jobs you could have Indeed, you could have LinkedIn, you could have Naukri.com, all of these. Rather than the individual doing this on each platform, Beacon would help us do this across these platforms in a more unified approach way. This is a white paper that could be used to actually understand a little bit more on what the key components of the Honest is and what it is hoping to achieve. So this is the URL for that. Another There's a lot of other deep dive technical stuff that we could take a look at, which could be found here. If you search for Beacon technical overview on YouTube, we can find a really good playlist which has 14 videos of the tech overview of things. This has been helpful in understanding how and what Beacon is aiming to achieve and how exactly they are trying to implement it using the different protocols. So moving on, a little bit of terminology before we head into things. So I talked about BAP. A BAP is essentially a Beacon application platform, and another one is BPP, which is Beacon platform, Beacon provider platform. So in this case, suppose if we have provider platform, it's essentially something like Khan Academy is a provider platform where there are different providers selling their own courses. And then there's the seeker platform where you can actually provide the unified experience where different seekers, such as the individuals who's actually searching for the courses, can come in and try to search across the different provider platforms and different providers. So in this way, we can have a unified platform to actually search across these provider platforms rather than the seeker going to a single provider platform to search for the content for the different providers. This is kind of an example that we have come up with to explain this a little bit better. So suppose NIT, the college, NIT and IIT and the other colleges, these are called the Beacon Provider Platform, the BPPs. They have their own courses that they want to put it out for the individual seekers to actually upskill themselves. So within NIT, IIT, and other colleges, you could have multiple departments such as CSE, mechanical engineer, electrical engineer, all of these, right? So these are providers, which is marked as P. So you have BPP, Beacon Provider Platform. You have provider. Provider are essentially the departments inside the BPP who are providing the content. And then you have the Honest network, which all these BPPs will be connected to, where they are broadcasting these courses across the Honest network. Now we have a organization, suppose NASCOM, which can be named as a Beacon application platform. This would essentially serve the course contents from all these different colleges, from across all these provider platforms, across all these providers for the seekers, which would help the seeker to essentially have a unified platform to actually access all the courses here. So if Honest wasn't here in the more traditional sense, what we have right now, it would be that okay, NASCOM would need to search for the courses in a single BPP and not across the platform itself. So Honest is kind of a bridge here, which would help us to unify this approach. Plus, there's interoperability being enabled currently using Honest. All right. So since this was kind of the overview of things, we can now dive into the actual setting up it on our locals. So this is the if you go to Beacon organization, there's a protocol server repo that we will be using. This is this is a repo where the requirements, basically it's an application, an API. We could actually go through it. It's a Node application, as in it uses Express for the API, and you have MongoDB, RabbitMQ for the queue. There's Redis and MongoDB for request and response caches. So the general architecture of this protocol server is something like this. So the thing that we have already talked about, the BAP. In the BAP, the client side application is the UI and the backend for the front end that we will be building on our end. This is the client side application. So if we are building a unified platform on the applicant side, this is the client side application that we'll be looking at. This will be our own custom Express, any application, backend and front end that we can use, any technology. There's no bottleneck on that. So this application triggers the client side gateway service, which I'll come to it in a bit. It'll be more clear once I actually deep dive into the setting up of things. So the reason why we have client side gateway service and the network side gateway service is to decouple these both. So the client side will be talking to the client side gateway only, and which will then append it to the message queue, which will then be picked up by the network side of the gateway, which will then request to the network. Here the network is basically the Honest network. So we have a sandbox ready, which we can actually add our applications as a network participant, where the participants can actually request to the network and you can get the data from the network to our application itself. So this is, we'll come to this we'll come back to this in a bit once we have a little deep dive on the code part of it. This will be more clear if we actually move on to that. So so for getting things started, as you can see, this is an empty repo for now. So we go ahead and first we go ahead and clone this server. So we do a git clone and we just name as BAP client PS, which is protocol server. BAP client protocol server is the name. We cloned this into here, and then we do a git clone of the same repo as BAP network protocol server. Right. So we have cloned the repo into two folders named as BAP client PS and BAP network PS. This, if you go back to this diagram, so this is BAP client PS. The protocol server is basically protocol server, the BAP client protocol server, and BAP network protocol server. So we have a couple of these, BAP client PS and BAP network PS. So once we have cloned this, we need to configure it. Even before configuring, I think we should be setting up the other dependencies such as the Redis, RabbitMQ, and MongoDB. So if you go into this repo, we have a Docker. I'm not sure if it's in. Yeah. So inside Docker, we have a Docker Compose YAML file, in which we have a Docker Compose file, which would actually set this up. So this is what I have it over here right now. So you can configure the username and the passwords, Tarka Labs password and Tarka Labs password. So basically the username and password. Then we can just get this up by docker compose minus f docker compose YAML and just doing a f minus d. Oops, sudo. So we have it running right now. We have a data folder now, which is a basically a volume mount where we are storing the Mongo and Redis data. So now if you go back to suppose the Docker client, we can see a Mongo is running, the RabbitMQ is running, the Redis is running. Okay. So now since we have that up and running, we can actually go ahead and configure the different protocol servers. For that, BAP client PS, we can go inside config and we can create default YAML file, and here we have a BAP. So within config we have a samples named BAP client.yaml. So if we open this, we can see that it's a placeholder YAML configuration. So this is how we are configuring this particular protocol server for the use case that we have. Since this is a BAP client protocol server, we'll be checking the BAP client YAML sample. Now we can just go ahead and copy this over here in the default. Now since we have the default ready, default YAML ready, so as you can see there's a lot of ports that there's a lot of other configuration that needs to be done right now. So I do have that for myself. We can walk through it right now, but so essentially, yeah. So where will my BAP client protocol server be running? This is that. So we set up that, okay, I want it on running on 5000. Then we can say that, okay, where is the Redis? Then the host of the Redis instance that we are running, it's localized. You can also set the DB, different DBs, since there are 12 DBs that is deployed. So this, all these information for connecting to Redis and all of that will be configured over here. So here if you see Redis, all of these, the username, password, everything is over here, so we can use that to just configure this. Now moving on, we have the localhost here, and then we say that, okay, the Mongo is the username, again as we had defined in the YAML file, is according to this Tarka Labs password. We can just say localhost, it's the same thing but still then we can have protocol server, the DB name. We are setting up the DB name over here. It can be anything on your end. So now moving on, this is the response cache that we are looking at. This is the Redis cache, this is the Mongo cache, and this is the basically the where it will be running. Then coming to the client side of things, uh, we we could use the synchronous, but for this demo we will be using the webhook, which is kind of more of a, it's a better way to deploy this on the production, as in you don't have to do a synchronous thing to run this on an asynchronous way. We use the webhook configuration. So in the webhook we can say this, I'll come to the why this is 3000. So essentially there's a client application that we had talked about earlier here, the client side application. So this would be a node or any API server that we are running, right? So in this case, we'll be running this on port 3000, and it will have an API named client callback where I will be receiving the responses. So breaking that down, I trigger, suppose I do a search courses, I do a search courses using this client side application. The network will basically provide the response on this particular webhook URL that I have configured. So I will be expecting the client side gateway service to receive the response from the network via this through the queue, receiving it, and then calling this particular API with the response. So I'll be expecting the response to be received via this API, is what the webhook means over here. So moving on, mode is BAP because this is a BAP. Gateway mode is client. You are also setting up inbox and outbox. What is the queue of the things? And on RabbitMQ, we have, again, based on the Docker Compose that we had seen earlier, we are setting up the username, password, and the host that we are running it on. So there's a lot of other endpoints. So these are the application level configurations. That okay, this application, this protocol serves as a BAP, a client, and this is the inbox and outbox for the queue, the name of the queues that we'll be using. Moving on to the actions. So actions is essentially the type of actions your application would be running essentially. So for this demo, there are different a lot of different API endpoints that is supported by Beacon Core. So if we go over here, understand. So this is, so there's a lot of discovery, order fulfillment, post fulfillment. This is essentially provided by the Beacon Core itself, on top of which we have the API contracts that is defined for Honest. So amongst these, right now we are just focusing on the discovery bit, where it is search and on search for demo purposes. But there are a lot of other APIs to actually fulfill the entire life cycle of a fulfillment of a course or a product on the platform itself. So since we are only focusing on search, we'll be removing all of these here as well. So we have search and we have on search. Okay. Now this is a private key. So the network, all the network participants on the network exchange data using digital signatures. What does that mean is essentially you use a, there's a private key and public key for each network participant. So this BAP will have one set of keys which will be then used. So the private key will be used to encrypt the data, and the public key will be used by the recipient to figure out that okay, this is the data coming from the network participant is verified. That is the way, I mean, just normal digital signature approach. So for creating these private keys and public keys, we have to go into, there is a util that Beacon has provided where we say that okay, npm, okay, even before that I think we'll have to install the stuff that is in package.json. So we just do an npm I. So it has installed all the stuff that is needed, the node modules. Then we move on to saying npm run generate keys. So it created a key pair where you can see the private key is here. So we just copy this and move it to the private key, and then we have a public key here which we then move to over here. So this is the way we actually move on to creating the private key and the public key. So now since we have a set of one set of keys for the BAP itself, so it will be the same for BAP client and BAP network. There's no differences in between both of these. We don't need separate keys for both of these. It's just across BAP. All right. So since we have configured all of these, there are a couple of other things that we need to still configure, which we'll be coming back to for some reasons. I'll come back to that. But essentially, once you have this configured, we'll be moving on to the BAP network config. So we have a similar folder called BAP network protocol server, and inside we are doing kind of exactly the same thing. We are saying default YAML. Here we go to the samples, we figure out okay, so this is, since this is a BAP network, we go to the BAP network YAML, we copy this, we add this over here. And similarly again, so since I have one already, BAP network, this is, suppose we are, wait, what is happening? Okay, yeah. So for BAP network, we are saying that okay, I want the BAP network to run on 7000. Similarly, we are configuring other stuff. Okay, Redis is on localhost, Mongo is on localhost, and this is the username password, localhost. And then we have a protocol server. This is the name of the MongoDB, which is the same that we had done earlier. Here again, we are not using the synchronous, we are using a webhook URL, and this is it, and then we are saying okay, this is the BAP network, inbox outbox, and then this is the Tarka Labs username, and password is password localhost 5672. Okay, here again we are removing all the other, because for demo purposes we're just focusing on search for now. Okay, so since we have configured this, now going back to the BAP client PS default YAML, we are just using the private key and public key over here directly, the same. Why same? Because the set of keys is global for the BAP itself, so it doesn't matter if it's a BAP client or a BAP network, the same. The set of keys will be the same. So we are configuring these for BAP network PS as well, and again these two needs to be configured right now. So now we have the BAP client configured, we have the BAP network configured, with the added nuance that okay, these two are still yet to come. Okay, now what we do is we go ahead and say that okay, npm run dev to just check if everything is all right. You can see there's okay, this was running successfully, server started successfully on a BAP client, and if we do the same on BAP network PS and then do an npm run dev, oops, I think I haven't installed stuff here, npm run dev, yeah, you can see a BAP network is also started successfully. So this means that we have configured it correctly for now, after which we'll be moving on to the configuration for BAP subscriber ID and URL. So for this, what we'll have to do is there's a ONS sandbox that we have that we'll be using to actually start as a register as a network participant to actually start communicating with the honest network in general. So there's a lot of other BAP BPPs that has been already configured. All these are test servers right now. A lot of people are actually trying to figure out how to connect to it, how to build applications on top of it. So here, for this, we'll need to deploy our network uh, side gateway service so that it is accessible on the internet to the honest network. So for that we'll be using ngrok, something like ngrok. So if we go here, ngrok http 7000. Why 7000? Because there's a BAP network, we have to deploy the network side gateway service to communicate with the network, because since this is decoupled, the client side application knows only about client side gateway service and the network knows about the network side gateway service. And we want to communicate with the network, so we would want to deploy this open to the internet so that the network can actually communicate with it. So since network side gateway service, which is BAP network PS, is going to run on 7000, we'll be deploying this on the, as in we'll be exposing this on the 7000 port. So we have this open. Now we have this. So this is basically being forwarded. The localhost 7000 will be forwarded to this particular address. Now this particular address is basically the subscriber ID that we'll be configuring across these two, that was missing in the earlier step. So now this particular, we can actually go ahead and okay, even before adding it here, what we'll do is we'll first add it as a network participant. So we go to here, we say that okay, this is the domain name. The domain name is whatever the domain that where you have deployed your 7000 as in the BAP network protocol server. So this is the domain here, so we use that as the domain. We submit, we say that okay, name, let's say Tarka Labs, any, this is these are some straightforward configurations. You can just pick it up as we are doing it. So now here the public key, it's asking for a public key, is the same as this one that we have configured. It should match because your protocol server has a set of so that is kind of the identity of the your protocol server that can be used. So which has a registry. I mean, when you register as a network participant, you are essentially adding yourself in a registry database. It's a flat database where there's a list of BAPs and BPPs which is subscribed to the network, and recognized by the network as an active participant. So, which is why the private key and the public key is kind of the identity for your application, which is why there should be the it should be the same. So this is the public key over here that we have used from the configuration. We have added here the encryption public key is something that is not being used currently, which is why we are just adding a dummy thing. So you can just go into onboarding tutorial, generate key, you'll get this encryption public key over here. So if you don't use this, there's an error coming up. I think that'll be fixed in the future, but for now this is how it is. You add the encryption. Wait, did I encryption public key? Yeah, okay. Yeah. So valid from, I have faced issues if you actually add it today. I think it's more of a 24 hours thing, which is why it's safe to do set it up a couple of days or some days earlier than today, whenever you are trying to run it. And then this is the valid to, let's say January, okay, 5th, let's say 5th. I am registering as a BAP, and the subscriber URL again is the root. I'm saying okay, domain. So there are multiple domains here. Why? Because there are so if BAP searches across all the BPPs, this there is a domain by which it can filter on. So if you want to search only for scholarship and grants, so this is financial support that we can use. If it's only for learning experiences or expert connect, this is the domain we'll be using. So you can use one single domain at one time. So this is the financial support that I'll be using. You can enter the city code as the STD trunk extension for a city, for a single city. For now I'll just do a star, which means all cities. So I submitted. I have successfully registered as a network participant. So if we open here, we can see that okay, this is the network participant that has been added to the network. So now since this has been added to the network, we go back here and we say that okay, this is kind of the domain, right? This is the domain. So this domain will be used as the subscriber ID, and in the URL it's the same, but only we can add with the protocol as well, which is HTTPS, this whole thing. So we have done that. Now in the registry URL, in the documentation we can find that the registry that the one that I had already talked about, it's essentially a database with a list of all BAP BPPs with the public keys to identify that okay, this is a viable and active participant in the network. This is the URL that needs to be added. We go ahead and say that okay, you need to authenticate as true, and the unique key is something that we will have to pick it up from let's say developing the APIs. Yeah, so this is kind of the command that does a lookup on the registry to figure out the list of BPPs or BAPs. So now if I go ahead and check this, we can say since we are registering a BAP, we have registered a BAP, we'll have to do lookup for a BAP. JQ is essentially a prettified version of JSON on the terminal. So if I do it, it'll be a pretty version of that JSON. So now if I hit enter, I can see there's a list of subscribers I can look up, which is essentially the same over here. If you go to all the BAPs, the list of all the BAPs I'm just looking it up over here. So now the one that we have subscribed is FEC4, which is this one. It says subscribed. There's a lot of other data here. So the unique key is basically this one, unique key ID. You use this to configure your application. Similarly, we go ahead and copy this whole thing. So we have done this on the BAP network. We do this on the similar thing on the BAP client as well. So now since that is done, we go ahead and we say we go to BAP client protocol server and we do an npm run dev. Alright, we have it running. BAP client is running right now. Now we go ahead and we do a BAP network PS, we do npm run dev. So just reiterating, right now we have a BAP client running on port 5000. We have a BAP network running on 7000. If we go back to the diagram, This is the client running on 5000. This is the network, BAP network side gateway running on 7000. This is deployed via ngrok on this particular domain, accessible to the internet, accessible to the network, and we have added this to the sandbox as a network participant to actually communicate with the network. And the message queue and the other Redis and Mongo that we have deployed on locally is via the Docker Compose that I had showed earlier. So now, since we have set this up, we need a client application now. So now if we go to here, we have a very simple dummy client application, which is essentially a Express server running on 3000. So if you notice here, we have a client callback, we have a search. So now coming back to what client callback was configured, localhost 3000 client callback, which means that okay, once the network gives you a response back, it will call this particular URL at 3000 to give you the response back. So that is why we had added this over in the client protocol server. So now we do a app post search. Actually, we can do that via Postman in a bit, but now if we have to run this, actually we'll have to do first, I think, npm install express, and then we do an npm install axios. So axios is for requesting. I'll come to that in a bit. So now we can do a node bap client application. So now you can see a server is running in 3000. Now if you go to Postman, we are doing a post call on local 3000 search. So basically the application that we have running over here, we are hitting the search endpoint. We provide a request body in which we have the context and the message. We are preparing the data. What we then do is we call the application running on 5000, which is essentially the client side gateway service. So now if you think about it, this is a 3000 running, the application running on 3000 port, our own application, which triggers the search running on 5000, which is on this front, localhost 5000 search. And then this takes care of all of these other things are abstracted away from us. We do not have to care about all of this. We don't have to change anything on the protocol server. Essentially, once you do a search on this on localhost 5000, it'll then relay it back to 7000, which will then request the network, and then the network will give you the response back on this, because we have done a webhook. You'll get it on client callback. Now this client callback we have configured as an API. So now if I hit, suppose, we can actually see the logs here as well, but okay. So now since everything, okay, one thing that we have missed is essentially once we are requesting it, we'll also need to tell that okay, this is the BAP that is requesting it over here. So this is not from here, we add it over here. Now we say that okay, I want you to, the domain is financial support, I want to do a search. This is the BAP ID that I have configured, that is the ngrok thing that we are deploying. And then we move on to saying that okay, give me the scholarship for undergraduates. This is the message essentially. Now once I hit search, I received the request over here as the search, and the JSON is being reverted back with, right? So this, as you can see, we have received an acknowledgement that okay, this network has received your request, and this, since this is a webhook, we'll be receiving the response of this on the client callback API URL. So now you can see we have received the data here. So received a response for client callback. So essentially the network called the configured client callback URL over here with the data we searched for. So now if we go through the actual data that we are seeing, you can see there's a message and there's a catalog. You can see all the providers and the fulfillments and the items that okay, this is the scholarship, this is the price, rateable or not, all the tags, categories, and all of that. And I did not receive one response. I received multiple responses. I received one response over here, and then again a response over here, and then again a response over here. So ideally, we would want to implement this as a socket connection, the client callback API URL, so that we can keep listening on um, what the data, what the responses are from the network, and based on that, we can do whatever changes that we need on the front end. So that is how we will be receiving it. And how are we configuring that? We are configuring it that over from here. So now, even going back to here, localhost 3000 application triggers a search on localhost 5000, which relays to the network side of things, which is running on 7000. It requests the network. So this is, since this is deployed as an ng-rock, accessible via the internet, it can communicate to the network, which is then added as a participant over here. So which is why it's able to, since it also has the public key and the private key and all of that. So it validates, it checks that okay, the data is coming from a correct client, and the network collates all the responses and gives it back on the client side of things via the client callback API that we are configuring here. So now a key difference between what we are saying is, I mean, this whole flow is actually pretty well described in this diagram. So the BAP requests the body with context and message, signs the body with the private key, request to the gateway. So now this is a new thing that is a network participant. If we go here, we can actually take a look at it. Now we can do two. You can see a BG over here, Sandbox Honest Gateway. So this gateway is essentially the middle ground in the network that receives the request from the BAP. It gives you an acknowledgement back. If you remember earlier when we did the Postman hit on the client application, we received an acknowledgement. So now after receiving the acknowledgement, it essentially broadcasts the search intent from the BAP to all the available BAPs. So the number 3, send the request to all available BPPs. So once all the available BPPs receive that request, it sends an acknowledgement to the gateway, after which the BPP directly gives you back the response. So now once I receive the response over here in the BAP, which is why we received multiple responses over here. So there, I mean, ideally, right now, I think since we are receiving 3 responses, maybe we received from 3 BPPs that are configured. So there's 1, 2, and 3. So the BPP, so one BPP responded with its catalog, and then another BPP responded with its catalog, and then the third one directly, as in the BPP directly responded. So now once you have a socket connection deployed on this particular URL or anyhow, you'll be receiving all the responses on that, and we can just update the front end based on that. So that is kind of what I had for us. uh, Please do go through the starter pack here, which essentially gives a quite a good understanding on the entire honest background of things. This is the protocol server, backend protocol server that we used essentially, and this architecture is again attached over here itself. There's a good explanation over here what I mentioned, but in a more maybe formal way. And sandbox.honest.network is essentially, you'll have to register using your uh, maybe Gmail or something that helps you register on this, and then use that to add yourself as a network participant. Yep.